Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Today we'll be doing a master study of a watercolor piece by Swedish master Anders Zorn. Art blogs, Q&As, sketches, deconstructed paintings, video notes, and art gifts are all at a single convenient and affordable tier for patrons on Patreon. So I decided to go with a Daniel Smith color, Sodalite Genuine, for this study. It's a lovely low-intensity blue mineral color, similar to indigo, but it's even grayer and it has a lovely granulating quality. I wanted a granulating color because Zorn's original painting has a speckled look to the paint, possibly caused by his paper choice or maybe his pigment choice or how the artwork has aged. Whatever the reason, I liked the added visual texture there and decided to use a granulating color for my study. This is great for added interest because the whole piece will only be one color anyway. My Sodalite is not in a tube because I don't like tubes, and it's actually not a watercolor pan either. It's a watercolor stick by Daniel Smith. And that's because I wanted this color but I didn't want to buy tubes, and when I found out it came in a stick, I thought I'd try it out. And I used it like conventional watercolor paint by cutting off some of the stick with an X-Acto knife and putting it in a palette. It's much easier for me to use that way. Anders Zorn has been on my list for a while for rounding out my Master Studies playlist here on YouTube. And I picked two paintings a long time ago for two videos, one to do in watercolor and the other in gouache. He did a lot of his early work in luminous watercolors, though he switched to oils in his later career. I really loved this charming little watercolor piece of his despite the somber subject. I was lucky enough to see it in real life on display, and whenever you see watercolors in person, it's a great reminder for just how much prettier this medium is. No scan or photograph can really do justice to a watercolor painting, and the same goes for filming videos. And I'm painting it at a 7 by 10 inch size, but I recall his was actually at an even smaller scale. I could have gone smaller, but 7 by 10 inches felt fun for a change, larger than what I've been painting for many months, so it felt like luxuriously large at this point for me. And if you paint this study in white or in red, she can easily be turned into a bride, and now thinking about it, that's what I should have probably done to make it less tragic. Oh well, I can just pretend she's attending her wicked stepmother's funeral and that she's not a young widow, unless of course she totally hated her husband. Anyway, I do like it in the Sodalite blue. You can check out my other video where I swatch all my Grisaille grays to see what other cool neutral options I had to pick from. When I put them all in a grid, I ended up having 19 different cool neutrals. So this monochromatic piece is perfect for Grisaille practice, a great way to practice your drawing and rendering and shading with your paint rather than with your pencil. If you want to paint along, my sketch for the Zorn study, as well as an image of the original reference, is available for patrons on Patreon. I love it when patrons share their art in my patron community section, and I can give lengthy input there if patrons want. I've been using non-Arches papers for the last several painting projects, and was back to Arches or Arches hot press watercolor paper for this study finally, and it really is a marvelous paper because I was thinking as I was painting, why are all the blends and gradients and liftings so much easier? This is like almost painting itself. And then I remembered I was using Arches, and I think that always really proves to me that I don't have a bias. I use several different papers at this point because I bought them out of curiosity, and I can say from going back and forth between them that even when I'm not paying attention, Arches really works the best, for my techniques at least, with Fabriano being my second favorite, and of course both are pure cotton watercolor papers. The eyes are the focal point in many paintings, and most certainly in this one. I spent a good amount of time trying to make sure the eyes were looking down and sideways in an alluring way without too many details, because it's really just implied with the pupils melting into the lashes and melting into the shadow under and over the eyelid. The veil is over her face and blurring things together, so the different parts of the eyes are not clearly disparate entities here, so I tried to make them melt together and apply the way Zorn did. And I wanted the eyebrows to be prominent without being harsh, so smudging the first pass out before adding a bit more over top achieves that. It gives you some softened edges. Zorn was famous for his clarity of rendering. He didn't produce muddy colors or overdone shapes or fussy details that were unnecessary. He had loose brushstrokes comparable to John Singer Sargent's, and both men were influenced by the bold brushstrokes of the Impressionists. I tried to maintain that here despite my being a finicky, detail-oriented artist because I tend towards a more botanical painting watercolor style. Even the face, which is the focal point, has minimal details. I really had to fight not to go back and add details to the lips and more shadows to shape the end of her nose and so on. Zorn was famous also for capturing a subject's unique personality, and I wonder if this widow was a real widow or just a model posing as one. She certainly looks very genuinely somber to me, but that's what Zorn was trying to capture after all, and Zorn was really good at what he did. He did many self-portraits as well as many paintings of his fiancée and later wife, Emma Lamb. Here's one of his self-portraits with a female model who was a prostitute like many artist models in his time, and the sort of lurid candor of this portrait and the whole scene. And here are two paintings where he used his wife Emma as a reference. Both are executed in watercolors as well. I love the oriental aesthetic and colors in the piece with the parasol. It creates a vibrant canopy of design around the figure. But the second piece, it's just in a league of its own. And it's one of my favorite watercolor pieces by Zorn. The delicacy, transparency, the capturing of light, and the looseness of the brushstrokes as the woman is bending over, both in the woman and all the fabric around her, really mark why he has endured as a Swedish master painter. It's usual to work from light to dark in watercolor since values are built up in layers of glazes as the paint gets thicker, but sometimes I'll see a reference where my eye naturally wants to go from dark to light. For me, this happens when I'm looking at a mostly dark piece with only a few light areas. Then I just keep mentally jumping ahead to filling in the darks fast and first. I did that a bit in this study and switched back and forth from doing lighter and darker areas rather than just going linearly from light to dark. It did speed it up for me because I used thicker paint for a lot of the darker areas in the dress pretty soon. It was very freeing to just imply the hand lost in the long sleeves, or the arm against the dark dress, or the gauzy veil just blurring out at the poofy ends. It's yet another reminder about the power of suggestion. Often the implication of something is more effective and more attractive and more artistic than spelling it out with exacting strokes. discover that the watercolor stick by Daniel Smith has the same paint consistency, at least in the soda light color, as my Albert Dürer Faber-Castell watercolor pencils. Like the watercolor pencils, it's silky as a wet paint mixture and lovely in transparent glazes, but it does have a bit of waxy buildup that makes it slippery to use once it gets dense and thick. I found that out on the very dark areas of the dress, that there's a bit of resist to the paint when it's thicker, just like with watercolor pencils. This doesn't happen with watercolor tube or pan paint that I have. It's a result of the pencil, crayon, and stick forms having a bit of waxy binder to hold them in that shape without being brittle. Doing the trim and the final folds on the veil was icing on the cake for me. This is just exactly what watercolor does so well. Translucent glazes of color that you can stack like colored slides. So it's the perfect medium for anything translucent like gems, stained glass, petals, insect wings, or the whisper thin fabric of the veil. I was able to save the whites of my paper for highlights and didn't need to use any white temper-saving paint anywhere, but I have used white to correct mistakes in other pieces. Masters like Zorn also used it. There's some white paint in the hair area of his original painting of this widow, for example, and I've seen many of his original watercolors up close when they were on exhibition in San Francisco a few years back, and I noticed that he used white gouache for highlights and lighter passages in a painting often. He also made use of photos to have references for action pieces like boats gliding over waves, unusual angles, proper facial likenesses, and all sorts of things. Polishing off the pops of contrast around the face is the last thing to do that'll help draw attention there. So I took care to darken the veil on the side of the face and the hairline like Zorn has them. I always love a beautiful figural piece, and I have so much respect for Anders Zorn as a painter that this was a real treat. I hope you found this fun and informative too. At least for me, it's one of my favorite Grisaille studies. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website links and Patreon page to support my art and art channel below. Thanks for parking your brushes here, and wishing you all fantastical Grisaille adventures.